the growth of secularism does not necessarily equate to more progressive. There can be secular right as well.
Yes, there is research on this, and that's a very, very good question. And this is kind of what I was hinting at earlier when I said, the mobilization of the nuns may not be inevitable. There's good research on this. A book by Cimino and Smith. What was the title? Atheist Awakening. Yes. Thank you. And it's a study of atheist and non-religious organizations and mobilizations, and they and a number of other people have documented this. Stephen LeDrew has documented this. Lots of people have found a libertarian wing of the secular movement. Now, I don't mean to conflate sort of libertarianism with far right-wing movements or to equate this to right-wing European movements, but only to say that iconoclastic views on religion in an established society, in a cultural situation in which religion has often been sort of entrenched as culturally dominant, can set people up to be prepared to accept all kinds of iconoclastic ideas about the political spectrum, about philosophy, about culture and art and their society. So yes, there is some established research that it's not the progressivism is not inevitable. I will say that I'm working on a paper right now about atheist attitudes towards Muslims and whether or not atheists are more Islamophobic than the general population, and they are not. They actually express very, very accepting and tolerant views of Muslims in society, more so than religious believers or people who express strong belief in God. But we only know that after testing it through multiple waves of survey data. That was not something that was a given when we set out to test this, and that's one of the reasons why we did this particular study. So yeah, it's a good question, and it's one I think we need to be careful about.
Do any of you know the religious breakdown of the Bernie Sanders supporters?
They are all secular Jews. No. I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know.
I'm angry about this because I have data sitting on my computer and could get you those numbers in 45 minutes.
Yeah.
I'm really curious, given you mentioned before that millennials have very different conceptions of authority. We also have very different conceptions of belonging and membership. And my guess is we have very different conceptions of what participation in civic life looks like. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how or if what you're measuring as civic participation has changed, because my guess is it looks very different for millennials than it does for even Xers, and let alone boomers, who had much more faith in institutional life.
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, and there's good research on how just the way Americans do civic engagement has changed even in the last 50 years. So it used to be that you joined the Kiwanis or whatever, and you were kind of a member in something, and then that kind of has shifted, and that isn't really so much how people do civic engagement anymore, especially millennials. And I think that especially with online activism and online communities, especially among the non-religious communities, that is something that we need to think about in terms of, is joining a center or a community really what is that the only thing that counts as civic engagement, or can it be other things? Yeah.
You're spot on.
Yeah.
It's changing.
Yeah, it's something that we're kind of just becoming, I think, cognizant of in social sciences.
Yeah. I think my average students think that if they like something on Twitter or post something on Instagram, that's civic engagement.
But, are you counting youth in Ferguson in the same way as you're counting the folks who joined the Kiwanis?
Right.
Is there a distinction? Because
Yeah.
my guess is that there are many, many, many people participating in ways that are not being tracked.
Right, yeah. So I think definitely the survey categories that we have for have you volunteered for the following groups, right? I think they're, even in surveys that we have created, are pretty lacking in terms of getting at this kind of social justice work that's especially important for millennials and everybody, and so I think definitely our survey categories are in need of changing, and that's something that we're working on with Chris Stedman, actually, is trying to make a better survey of what civic engagement looks like.
Yeah, I mean, the first women's march in January of last year, the first one, I was with my family in LA, and they said it was the largest march in LA history. So, I mean, it was massive, and there were a lot of millennials. So, absolutely, that's how everybody knew to go. I mean, it's fantastic.
All right. Well, I think that wraps up our keynote panel. Let's give a round of applause to our wonderful panelists.
Thank you all for being here. My name is Penny Edgell. I am a professor in the sociology department over at the University of Minnesota. I've known Phil for a long time, and it is my great pleasure to work with both Jackie and Evan on various kinds of research projects and all other kinds of things too. So I'm very happy to be here tonight at this panel. And I'll get out of the way and start. I think we have 5 community panelists, and just to kind of confirm, I was just told to maybe give you some focus questions to respond to, and then we'll just open it up, and I will rely heavily on the timekeeper. And the first thing I would like you to do, I always just think it's a little nicer if you could just go down the line and introduce yourself, say your name and what organization you work with or represent.
Great. I'm Peter Murray. I work with Outfront Minnesota. I do all of our faith organizing work, and I also work in our anti-violence program. And I feel like a Bond villain.
I'm Mike Freiberg. I'm a state representative in my 3rd term. Represent all or parts of Crystal, Golden Valley, New Hope, and Robbinsdale.
State Representative Raymond Dean. I'm also in my 3rd term. My district is in Minneapolis, and it's most of downtown Minneapolis, southern part of North Minneapolis, North Loop in between, and a bit of Bryn Mawr and Elliott Park.
Pastor Danny Givens. I wear a whole bunch of hats, but I'm here as an activist for Black Lives Matter Minneapolis, but I also am a statewide organizer with MUSJA, Minnesota Unitarian Social Justice Alliance.
And I'm Ashley Horan. I am the executive director of MUSJA, the Minnesota Unitarian Universalist Social Justice Alliance, also wearing many hats, but that's the one tonight.
Thank you so much, all of you, for being here tonight with us. I want to start, just see if you can each give us a short, and I was told to tell you, like 2 minutes, recap of the work you do, but mostly to give us a sense of the diversity of the populations and constituencies that you work with, in particular religious diversity, non-religious diversity. I've got some follow-up questions too. You can go in any order.
Just go down the line?
Sure.
All right. So I kind of wear 2 hats at Outfront. I work both in our anti-violence program with LGBTQ people who have experienced some form of harmful religion. So that could be an anti-LGBTQ sentiments growing up, or conversion therapy, or the sign waivers outside of Pride. So it's sort of that gambit. But I also work organizing with congregations and faith communities working on LGBTQ inclusion. And a lot of that work now is focusing on exploring gender identity, transgender justice with faith communities. And so I see both sort of the people in the queer community who have been harmed by their spiritual homes or their spiritual upbringings or their religious upbringings, and people who are seeking that.
I guess as when you're an elected official, you tend to kind of split things up a little bit. I mean, I represent several inner ring parts of several inner ring suburbs. So, I don't know that the religious diversity of the district I represent is that different from Minnesota as a whole. But then when you're working, those are the people you represent. But then also when you're working on policy at whatever elected level you're at, in my case, it's this Minnesota House of Representatives. There you may be more likely to encounter some of the groups, whether they're religiously affiliated or not. So, I've worked with some of the more liberal, I consider myself a pretty liberal, progressive Democrat, so I've worked with, there's a group called Isaiah that includes several of the more social justice more social justice leaning organizations. I've worked with them on issues like foreclosure reform, for example. I also do, I'm on the health committee, my background's in public health policy. So a big issue I've worked on is immunization policy. I'm very pro-immunization, pro-vaccine. I think reducing the scourge of vaccine-preventable diseases is a good thing, but there is a minority, a very small minority of people who happen to be very vocal who believe that certain vaccines are harmful. And so I have found on issues like that groups of religiously unaffiliated, I know there was a gentleman over here who didn't like the use of the word reason necessarily, but at least groups that have an appreciation of science, not that, there aren't religious people who don't appreciate science as well. There certainly are, but I have found it is one group among many are religiously unaffiliated people who are inclined to support policy that is grounded in science, which is what I'd like to think the stuff I'm advocating for is.
Mm-hmm.
I guess for me, most of my work focuses around social justice type issues. Before I got into elected office, I was engaged on issues around mass incarceration, and that's like all down the spectrum, not just how we prosecute, but also how people enter back into the society after we've locked them away. The community I represent, I always like to say, is over-policed, overcharged, over-prosecuted, and over-incarcerated. It doesn't happen by accident. So fighting against those systems are always tough, and that brings me into a wide range of folks, because working with Isaiah, working with other groups around these issues, we can focus on the issues. And I don't care. No, I really don't care what brings someone to the table on these issues that want to change it. As a matter of fact, I welcome all people, whatever motivates them to impact that change. And I think that's one of the things that I think being in elected office has aided me in understanding that there's so much that needs to be done that if someone's willing to do it with me, I'm not going to question their motives. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I always get really excited about is every year there's a prayer day for me. They can pray for me. I don't have an issue with that. But it's just, because there is a group of people at the Capitol that's like a really, really critical thing. And so I'm sure you get it, Mike, as well, that there's going to be a day that there's going to be a bunch of people praying for me. And, if it helps me, great. If it doesn't, that's fine. I don't wake up in the morning going, oh, today's going to be a great day. Because they're praying for me. I wake up and say, oh, great. Some people are doing this. So that's my perspective.
So the work I do with Black Lives Matter Minneapolis, I'm the clergy liaison. And so my role there was around mobilizing both folks of faith and folks of non-faith who felt called to the front lines of activism and organizing and community protests. So I've done work with the Minnesota Rabbis Association. I've done work with the Catholic Workers Union. I've done work with definitely with Moosja prior to my being on staff at Moosja. I've done work with Outfront Minnesota. BCUC, Black Clergy United for Change, which is a millennial organization that was started to address some of the issues that we were facing in communities of color. And then I've also done work with the Minnesota 8, the Khmer 8 refugees who were detained. And so what that work was around getting people of faith to show up during deportation hearings to have community representation. So that's just a brief little list of some of the kind of intersections I've been at.
And our work at the Minnesota UU Social Justice Alliance is both internal to Unitarian Universalism. We work with the 26 Unitarian Universalist congregations around Minnesota to do convening, bringing people together, and capacity building, developing leadership and skills for social justice and organizing work. We also do a lot of partnership. Peter and I are both a part of a table called March, Multi-Faith, Anti-Racism, Change and Healing. And that is an interfaith organization that does grassroots community organizing and working with, at the intersection of, it's a table that grew out of 20 years of work around progressive faith folks showing up for LGBTQIA stuff. And then as the world has shifted, understanding that we can't protect LGBTQ folks without also dealing with white supremacy culture in the world. And so the current work is really around mobilizing people of faith to show up in support for people of color and other frontline community-led organizing for racial and other forms of social justice.
Thank you. So it occurs to me that we've talked a lot tonight about shifts, right, in this landscape, right, with the movement to where there's more non-religious Americans means there are fewer religious Americans, right? And it may also mean that these religious Americans are themselves organizing potentially in different kinds of ways to respond to these shifts. So I'm wondering if in your partnering, have you noticed a shift either in the way that you partner with religious groups and organizations or emerging new secular partnerships or constituencies or liaisons? This is not, you don't have to go on a line.
You know, yes, I think. You know, I mean, I'm in lots of different spaces, and the thing that I see when I'm in a lot of these spaces is religion isn't the focus.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the focus is the oppression that's going on, and how do we counteract where our society's gotten to us today. Mm-hmm. So yes, and I don't know. It seems to be a shift because it seems to be a heightened consciousness and a heightened awareness of the world we've created, you know, this notion of white supremacy and how many people like me are products of a system that I had no part in creating, but I have definitely had a huge part in benefiting from. And I think that that's the shift is, I think it's a lot more acceptable for some people to begin to understand that, yeah, maybe the system was set up to advantage me. And I think that that's opening up a different type of dialogue. Now, is it happening fast enough? No, it's not happening fast enough at all. And has the current president expedited some of this? I mean, I think there's a possibility that that's happened. Just because I think that some people are going, oh my God, this is like a glaring example of the system that we've created and how bad it can be.
Thank you.
I would say that there's definitely been a shift, and in just looking at the work that folks in Minnesota on the ground, faith folks, have done on the ground around the marriage amendment work that has happened, and seeing folks actually, I think this was like one of the more prominent stances where folks really came out of their cubicles and other places where they were about how they were feeling about this particular amendment, and taking not only to the street, but lending their voice to it, lending their dollar, lending their time, and so forth and so on. And then I think another shift came with the inception of Black Lives Matter Black Lives Matter as a movement nationally, with taking place, public stage and public place, with saying that issues are really real and inviting folks to participate at that intersection, you know, with folks who identify with that. And I think that created this trend and shift where folks were like, hey, we can actually go from having these disgruntled holiday table conversations with, you know, Uncle so-and-so who has all of these identities and, you know, implicit biases. We can now take this to a space and place where there's a community, there's a platform where it's received, and it's actually, there's some work that's done around it. So I believe that there has been a shift in that.
Okay.
I've noticed too, I think a shift that I observe is that folks in the liberal and progressive congregations that I'm working in are yearning not just for a spiritual home, but a political home. And people in movement spaces, in social justice spaces, are also yearning for a spiritual home. There is a symbiosis between those that I think institutional church and institutional membership organizations are both missing. And the folks, and I think that is one of the big reasons for this increase in the nuns, is that it becomes more and more clear, especially for progressive and leftist people, that you cannot separate the spiritual and the political. And I mean spiritual in a very broad sense. I'm a Unitarian Universalist. We have probably the largest number of self-defined atheists among our congregations of any denomination. So I think there's this deep yearning for places that don't eschew each other. And I think the brick and mortar church model and the membership organization model are no longer meeting those needs. And so what I'm finding is that people are creating, almost going back to like house church models of doing things. I think that people are deeply in need of community that shares political and spiritual depth together. And so I'm noticing people, Adrienne Marie Brown, a prescient teacher of social justice strategy and spirituality in today's world, talks about the concept of fractals, and that what we practice at the smallest scale sets the patterns for the largest scale. And so social justice movements that are successful and sustainable now are practicing deep ways of being in community with each other that are not just about transactional relationship and organizing goals. And so folks are creating deep relationships that go beyond what has traditionally existed in kind of organizing and activist spaces, and I think vice versa for congregations that are where people are finding traction to belong. So I'm noticing in my work that there are a lot of millennials, for example, who will, quote unquote, belong to a church, but their primary form of engagement will be in the social justice work of that congregation, and then the reflection or spiritual praxis that goes along with that. So that's a shift that I'm noticing really hard right now.
That rings true to me too. I think, in the marriage equality movement, there were. It was one of the first movements where faith communities and people of faith were engaged in a pro-LGBTQ way. And 64% of Catholics voted against the ban on same-sex marriage, and so it was. But I think since then, like Ashley was saying, that membership-based organizations out front has shrunk threefold since the marriage equality movement, and a lot of the churches that showed up in that way no longer do for LGBTQ equity, except, or that's true, I think, in kind of the bubble of the Twin Cities, but in greater Minnesota, a lot of, in a lot of places where transphobia is fairly rampant, but there is a welcoming or supportive church, that is a place where a transgender person finds community, purpose, home, spiritual home, volunteer engagement. And that's been my experience in a lot of work that I've done.
I guess I'll just talk sort of about a shift I've seen personally. It's very exciting for me to be on a panel with two people involved with the Unitarian Church. I am a practicing Unitarian myself. And when Phil was talking...
Don't worry, you'll get it right at some point.
Yeah, Phil was talking about how people tend to drop away from their religion, when they're in their 20s and their 30s, and I fit that mold. And I fit that mold during that time. I mean, for a while I started wondering, like, geez, if I can't even stick with being a Unitarian, maybe this whole organized religion thing just isn't for me. But sure enough, lo and behold, I have a couple kids now and started going back a couple years ago too. And I go to the White Bear Unitarian, even though it's really far away from where I live, but my sister and her family go there too. And, I just don't remember growing up as a Unitarian. I don't remember all the discussion about social justice issues in the sermons and the youth education. I think it's great. I think that they're doing that, but and what you said about it, most of the people there being atheists, I think is correct too. So, that is a group of most, I don't know. Can you call them? You can't really call them nuns, I guess, or unaffiliated because they go to a Unitarian church. It really depends on who you talk to. Yeah. So, but just hearing about all those political issues, there in church is new for me, and I don't know. I think it's pretty cool.
Okay, so I have a question that's more about my own research. So what the heck? I'm going to ask you because you're all sitting here and you're a captive audience. But I'm really, and I've got one of my other graduate students that I work with, Jack Delahanty, is doing some work on the religious left, right? And in academics, we hear a lot about the religious left, and then there's always, will it be a counterpart to the religious right? And so it's, as the discourse shifts very quickly, in my view, into mapping newly emerging progressive religious activism and coalitions onto this kind of older left-right binary. And so one of my questions for you is, does that mapping even make sense? Is that a good way to think about more newly emerging progressive religious activism? And just what are your experiences with working with kind of organized, either whether it's religious left or progressive secular coalitions? How do you think about that part of the landscape?
I mean, I'll start. I think yes, it's worth mapping. One of the things that sort of sits with me in an awkward way is that for people on the religious right, if you're not 100% with them, you're not with them. And I would say for people on the religious left, that's not as critical as
Right.
if, are you engaged in things that they believe are going to have a positive impact on many, many people's lives. You know, the mapping of religion is a fascinating study. I've personally mapped through many different phases, and you know, in being an elected official, I spend time in Christian churches. I spend time in. I don't have a lot of temples, but you know, out with the Jewish community, I attended the mosque for a long time, and it's really amazing how no one really owns me as theirs, but yet they don't discard me as theirs. If that makes sense. And I think for me, that's a really great way for me to navigate my world. Because I don't have a particular faith. I'm a humanist by sort of philosophy, and as far as I'm concerned, they're all part of that piece. But no, I think it's good to map that and try to understand that. And maybe my perception's completely wrong, but I think my personal experience probably relates similar to other people's experiences.